Every frontier attack left a scar, and some scars demanded revenge. These were not random raids. They were calculated counterstrikes, shaped by loss and carried out by warriors who had already paid the highest price. When a home was burned or a family was taken, the answer did not come with treaties or negotiations. It came on horseback in the dead of night, with the resolve of men who had nothing left to lose. On the Great Plains, the pattern rarely changed. A village attacked, a family killed, and then the warriors rode. They rode not for glory, not for conquest, but because the frontier offered no justice except the justice they created for themselves. Their world was shrinking, their people pushed back step by step, and every assault tightened the spiral that led them toward retaliation. History remembers the battles, the raids, and the massacres. But what it often forgets is what came after. The counterstrikes. The moments when native warriors chose not to endure suffering, but to return it with precision and relentless determination. These were the blows that shook forts, broke armies, and echoed across generations. Tecumseh, Roman Nose, Geronimo, Crazy Horse, Quanah Parker, Red Cloud. Their names carry the weight of defiance and the memory of a world fighting to survive. What they led were not simple attacks, but deliberate responses to loss, fueled by strategy, courage, and an unbroken sense of duty to their people. These are the 10 most powerful revenge attacks ever carried out by native warriors. Strikes born from tragedy, executed with discipline, remembered long after the dust settled. This is when the warriors struck back. The burning of Prophetstown in 1811 changed Tecumseh forever. It was not just the loss of a village. It was the destruction of a vision he and his brother had worked years to build. It was the breaking of a promise between nations carried out with fire gunpowder, and the certainty that native power in the Great Lakes was meant to fade. For Tecumseh, it marked a line that could not be crossed without consequence. He did not answer with rage alone. He answered with organization. Tecumseh began forging one of the largest native alliances the region had ever seen, uniting Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and others under a single cause. He believed that no tribe could survive alone, but together they could form a wall strong enough to hold back the push of American expansion. What he built was not a raiding party. It was a coalition ready for war. When the War of 1812 erupted, Tecumseh saw his opportunity. This was his moment to strike back, not through scattered retaliation, but through coordinated counterattacks across the frontier. His tactics were built on speed and surprise. He used forests as cover, rivers as pathways, and night as his ally. Small bands moved quickly, struck hard, and vanished before American forces could respond. Every ambush reminded the frontier that the alliance was alive and watching. The turning point came at Detroit. Tecumseh and British General Isaac Brock worked side by side using deception as their greatest weapon. The American commander believed he faced thousands of warriors ready to overwhelm the fort in a brutal assault. In truth, Tecumseh used movement war cries and carefully staged formations to convince the enemy that resistance was hopeless. The American garrison surrendered without a shot being fired. It was one of the most humiliating defeats the United States suffered during the war, and it happened because Tecumseh understood fear as well as strategy. His counterstrike after Prophetstown was not just revenge for a burned settlement. It was a statement that native power could still unite, still resist, and still change the outcome of a war. Detroit became the symbol of what a determined alliance could achieve when guided by a leader who refused to accept defeat as destiny. The winter of 1890 marked one of the darkest moments in Lakota history. At Wounded Knee, more than 200 men, women and children were killed in a storm of gunfire that left the snow stained with blood. For the survivors, the massacre was not just another loss in a long chain of defeats. It was the breaking point. It was the final insult delivered against a people who had already endured generations of war hunger and forced removal. In the days that followed, the survivors did not retreat into silence. Small groups of Lakota warriors gathered around Pine Ridge, driven by anger and grief, looking for any opening to strike back. Their actions were not the large-scale battles of earlier years. They were fast, sharp, and precise. Warriors moved at night, slipping through the frozen hills, hitting isolated patrols and outposts before melting away into the darkness. Each strike was a reminder that the Lakota spirit had not been extinguished at Wounded Knee. The tactics they used reflected the reality they faced. The United States Army had overwhelming numbers and modern firepower.
I see
The
movement.
Lakota had speed knowledge of the land and the will to make every moment count. Their attacks came without warning, often lasting only minutes, but the effect was unmistakable. Soldiers at Pine Ridge found themselves unable to predict where the next blow
To the
would
ridge
fall.
line.
Every sound in the night became a warning. Every shadow felt alive. These were not battles meant to reclaim territory. They were not campaigns aimed at turning the tide of war. They were acts of defiance driven by the need to answer an unspeakable loss. For the Lakota, the ghost dance had promised a world restored, a world where the dead would return and the old ways would rise again. After Wounded Knee, that hope transformed into something sharper. It became a determination to show that even in the face of near extinction, the power of the Plains warrior still had a voice. These retaliatory strikes were small in scale, but they carried enormous meaning. They were the last sparks of resistance on the northern plains, the final echoes of a warrior tradition that refused to fade quietly into history. In the years ahead, the guns would fall silent, the camps would be broken apart, and the Lakota would be forced into a new and unfamiliar world. But in those cold nights after Wounded Knee, their retaliation served as the last roar of a people pushed too far, a reminder that even when surrounded, the spirit of the plains did not surrender. The spark that ignited the Nez Perce War did not begin on a battlefield or at a council table. It began with a killing. When settlers took the lives of several relatives of Nez Perce warriors, the loss cut deep into a community already under immense pressure to surrender its homeland. The wound was personal, raw, and impossible to ignore. For the younger warriors, the idea of doing nothing was unthinkable. The frontier demanded answers, and they intended to give one. A small group of these young men carried out the first retaliatory attacks. They moved quickly, striking isolated homesteads and small parties of settlers they believed responsible for the violence against their families. These were not large-scale operations. They were acts of personal justice driven by grief and a sense that their people were being pushed past the point of endurance. The retaliation was meant to be limited, but the consequences would soon grow far beyond anything they expected. As word spread, American military forces mobilized, convinced that the Nez Perce had launched a coordinated uprising. In reality, their actions were still small and scattered. But the response was swift and overwhelming, and it left the Nez Perce with only two choices: surrender or run. Their leaders chose neither. They chose to fight strategically, delaying the army long enough to protect their families and buy time to escape. The young warriors employed the tactics that had defined their people for generations. They fired from high ridges where the terrain hid their numbers and gave them control of the battlefield. They used thick brush and wooded slopes to disappear before soldiers could organize a counterattack. And when the pressure became too great, they retreated deep into the Bitterroot Range, a fortress of mountains and valleys that the army struggled to navigate. Every skirmish slowed the advancing troops and sharpened Nez Perce resolve. What began as a handful of revenge strikes soon exploded into one of the most legendary retreats in American history. Forced from ridge to ridge and valley to valley, the Nez Perce fled more than 2,000 kilometers in a desperate bid to reach the safety of Canada. Along the way, they fought running battles against multiple U.S. Army columns, outmaneuvering and outsmarting forces far larger than their own. Their journey became a symbol of resilience. But it all began with a small act of retaliation, a single spark that ignited a war and launched the Nez Perce on a path that would test every warrior, every family, and every mile of the land they crossed. In 1851, Geronimo's world shattered in a single afternoon. While he was away trading, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp, killing his mother, his wife, and his 3 young children. When he returned, the bodies were already cold. The loss was total, and it carved a wound so deep that it would shape the rest of his life. Standing over the graves of his family, Geronimo made a vow that he would never be a friend of the Mexicans. It was a promise he would spend decades fulfilling. His revenge did not come as one great battle. It came as a relentless series of raids that stretched across Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico for more than 30 years. Geronimo used the landscape like a weapon. The desert was his ally, the mountains his refuge, and the night his cover. He led small groups of warriors through country so harsh that most soldiers avoided it entirely. He struck swiftly, hit hard, and vanished before his enemies could mount a response. This was warfare built on movement. Geronimo could ride 70 miles in a single night, disappear into a canyon without leaving a trace, or reappear hundreds of miles away to strike another target. His raids blended personal vengeance with the broader struggle of the Chiricahua Apache to stay free as American and Mexican forces closed in from every direction. Each attack was meant to remind his enemies that as long as he lived, the frontier would never be safe. The armies sent to track him learned quickly that fighting Geronimo was like fighting the desert itself. He used ambushes in narrow ravines, sent decoys to mislead soldiers, and hid water caches where only Apache scouts could find them. Even when heavily outnumbered, he found ways to slip through encirclements that should have ended his war for good. The frustration of pursuing him became legendary. Officers described him as a ghost, a shadow, a man who could not be cornered by ordinary means. For Geronimo, the raids were more than retaliation. They were the continuation of an oath renewed with every attack, every escape, every mile of ground he reclaimed through sheer determination. His campaign became the longest sustained act of revenge in Native American history, a personal war that refused to end even as the world around him changed. By the time he finally surrendered in 1886, he had become one of the most feared and respected warriors on the continent. The man who began with a broken heart had turned his pain into a lifetime of resistance, proving that a single oath made in grief could echo across generations. By the early 1870s, the southern plains were falling silent. Not because the Comanche had laid down their weapons, but because the herds were disappearing. White commercial hunters were killing bison by the thousands every day, leaving the carcasses to rot across the grasslands. For the Comanche, the bison were more than food. They were identity, survival, and the center of their world. Watching them vanish felt like watching their future die in front of their eyes. Quanah Parker saw what was coming. The son of a Comanche chief and a captive white woman, he carried the weight of 2 worlds, but he fought fiercely for one, his people's right to live free. As the slaughter of the bison intensified, he made his decision. He would strike back not with a few warriors, but with overwhelming force. By the summer of 1874, Quanah had gathered nearly 700 Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne fighters. Their target would be the buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls. The attack came at dawn. Quanah led the charge across the open prairie, expecting to catch the hunters asleep. But the men inside adobe walls had powerful rifles, especially the heavy Sharps, 50 caliber guns capable of reaching targets at extreme distances. As Quanah and his men closed in, the crack of those rifles filled the air, cutting through the charge with deadly accuracy. The hunters held their position behind thick walls, while the warriors made repeated passes, firing from horseback and trying to force a breakthrough. The moment that defined the battle came from a single shot. Billy Dixon, one of the hunters, raised his Sharps rifle, aimed at a distant rider nearly a mile away, and fired. The bullet struck a Comanche warrior so far out that even Dixon admitted it was mostly luck. The shot traveled roughly 1,538 meters, one of the longest confirmed rifle hits of the frontier. It shocked both sides and forced the warriors to pull back. During the fighting, Quanah himself was wounded, but he refused to leave until his men were safely withdrawn. The assault on adobe walls did not achieve the victory Quanah hoped for, but it achieved something else. It forced the United States to respond. The attack convinced military leaders that the Plains tribes would not allow the destruction of the bison to go unchallenged. Within weeks, the Army launched a massive campaign that became known as the Red River War. It was the final decisive struggle for control of the Southern Plains. Quanah Parker's counterstrike was born from desperation and duty. It was a message that the Comanche would not watch their world be erased without answering in force. Though the battle did not bring down adobe walls, it ignited the last great war of the Southern Plains and marked the moment when one of the greatest Comanche leaders stepped fully into his role as a defender of his people. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 was not a battle. It was the destruction of a peaceful camp where Cheyenne and Arapaho families believed they were under U.S. protection. When the soldiers opened fire, they killed more than 100 people, most of them women, children, and elders. In the aftermath, the survivors carried the horror with them, but that sorrow soon hardened into a vow. The warriors of the Plains would answer what happened at Sand Creek. What followed was not a single act of retaliation, but a sustained campaign driven by rage and grief. Cheyenne warriors, joined at times by Arapaho and Lakota allies, began striking at the lifelines of the frontier. They targeted wagon trains along the Platte River, hit isolated homesteads, and attacked stage stations and military supply lines. The message was clear: every route used to push deeper into their lands would now come with a cost. Their tactics were swift and punishing. Warriors waited along ridges and river bends, watching for the dust clouds of approaching wagons. When the moment was right, they swept down with speed, firing arrows and rifles, cutting off escape routes, and overwhelming the defenders before they could form a line. They knew the terrain better than any soldier or settler, and they used it to disappear just as quickly as they arrived. Many raids lasted only minutes, leaving wagons burning behind them as they pulled away with captured horses and supplies. The railroads became targets as well. As tracks pushed westward, they symbolized the relentless advance that threatened native life on the plains. Cheyenne warriors struck work crews, destroyed equipment, and tore up rails, forcing work to halt again and again. What the government saw as infrastructure, the Cheyenne saw as the steel path that would bring more settlers, more soldiers, and more violence. Fighting it became part of their revenge. These counterattacks stretched across 4 years, from 1864 to 1868. They strained military resources, disrupted travel, and forced the United States to divert entire cavalry units to protect supply lines. The Cheyenne did not expect to win a war of territory. What they wanted was justice for Sand Creek, and every raid was a reminder that the massacre would not be forgotten or forgiven. The vengeance that burned after Sand Creek shaped the course of the Plains Wars. It altered military strategy, deepened tensions, and added fuel to a conflict already spiraling out of control. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, these years of retaliation were not just about striking back. They were about honoring the dead and proving that even in the face of overwhelming force, they would not allow their people's suffering to pass unanswered. Roman Nose was known across the plains as a warrior with a fire inside him. He carried himself with a fierce confidence that made him both respected and feared. But after Sand Creek, that fire became something deeper. The massacre had torn through his people, and for Roman Nose it marked a turning point. He would become one of the most unyielding symbols of Cheyenne vengeance, a man who believed it was better to fall in battle than to live under the shadow of injustice. In September of 1868, he rode toward Beecher Island with nearly 300 Cheyenne and Lakota warriors. Their target was a group of just 50 U.S. Army scouts, some of the toughest men on the frontier. The odds did not bother Roman Nose. He believed that a true warrior fought with skill, speed, and a willingness to face death without hesitation. And he expected the same from every man who rode with him. The battle erupted along the banks of the Arikari River. The scouts had taken shelter on a small sandbar and dug in, firing from behind makeshift trenches. Roman Nose watched their defenses, waited for the right moment, and then pushed his horse into a full charge. To him, the best way to break an enemy was to strike with overwhelming force and absolute fearlessness. He led his warriors in wave after wave of attacks, racing across open ground while bullets snapped through the air around them. The most enduring image of the battle came from those charges. Roman Nose rode straight into the gunfire, tall in the saddle, refusing to bend or slow down. Even the scouts admitted later that they had never seen a warrior command so much raw courage. His riders followed him into the storm, circling, firing, returning again and again to test the defenses of the trapped scouts. Every pass pushed the tension higher and drew them closer to a breakthrough. But courage alone could not break the fortified position. As the fighting stretched into the day, Roman Nose prepared for another charge, determined to lead from the front, as he always had. It was during this final ride that he was struck by a rifle shot. He fell from his horse mortally wounded, and his warriors carried him away from the field. He died soon after fulfilling the vow he had lived by, to meet his end in battle, facing his enemy head-on. Roman Nose's fury at Beecher Island did not bring victory, but it left a legacy carved into frontier memory. His bravery became legend, his defiance a symbol of Cheyenne resistance. And though the scouts survived, they never forgot the warrior who charged through their gunfire, as if death itself could not make him turn away. When the United States began building forts along the Powder River Basin in 1866, it was more than a military move. It was a declaration that the heart of Lakota territory would no longer belong to the Lakota. Red Cloud saw the construction for what it truly was, the beginning of a permanent occupation. Negotiations were offered, but he refused to sit at any table while soldiers hammered their posts into the ground. He believed that answering force with diplomacy would only invite more intrusion. Revenge, not discussion, would decide the future of his people. Red Cloud organized one of the most effective native war campaigns of the 19th century. His first targets were not the forts themselves, but the lifelines that kept them alive. He focused on the supply routes, long exposed trails where wagons, livestock, and soldiers were vulnerable. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors struck these routes with precision, overwhelming small detachments, stealing horses, and forcing the army into a state of constant frustration. Every wagon lost was a fort weakened. Every patrol hit was a message that the Lakota would not surrender their land without answering every advance. The counteroffensive grew in intensity. Red Cloud's warriors ambushed packed trains, hit work crews, and set fire to supplies meant to sustain the isolated forts through winter. Cavalry units found themselves pinned down or forced to retreat as they tried to protect the endless chain of wagons winding through the plains. The army had expected scattered resistance. Instead, they were facing a coordinated strategy driven by a leader who understood that striking the enemy's lifelines could be more powerful than any direct assault. At times, the fighting flared into full-scale engagements. Warriors concealed themselves in ravines along ridgelines or behind thick timber, waiting for the moment when soldiers would stretch too thin. When they attacked, it was with speed and overwhelming force. A patrol could be wiped out in minutes, and before reinforcements arrived, the warriors were already gone, leaving nothing but burned wagons and empty tracks behind. Red Cloud's campaign did something few native leaders ever achieved. It broke the momentum of American expansion. By 1868, the Army realized it could not hold the forts without suffering constant losses. Supply lines could not be secured, patrols could not move safely, and the Powder River country remained firmly under native control. In the end, the United States agreed to abandon its forts and withdraw entirely from the region. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was signed not because the Army wanted peace, but because Red Cloud had forced them to accept it. Red Cloud's counteroffensive became one of the rare moments in American history when the United States signed a treaty on native terms. It was a victory earned not by overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but by disciplined strategy and the unshakable will of a leader who believed that the land of his ancestors could still be defended. The winter of 1866 settled over the Powder River country with a sharp, biting cold. In that frozen landscape, Crazy Horse prepared a plan that would become one of the most brilliant ambushes in Plains history. He understood the terrain, the habits of his enemy, and the power of patience. But more than anything, he understood how to use himself as bait. On a frigid morning, Crazy Horse rode out alone, moving slowly across the snow, as if he were wounded or exhausted. He allowed the soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny to see him, knowing exactly how they would react. The sight of a lone Lakota rider was too tempting for the officers inside the fort. They believed they had a chance to cut off a scout or capture a warrior. Within moments, 80 men were mounted and chasing after him, confident that victory was already in reach. Crazy Horse let them follow. He kept just far enough ahead to draw them deeper into the hills and ravines where his allies were waiting. To the soldiers, it must have seemed like they were closing the gap with every stride. But every step they took brought them closer to the trap. As the pursuit carried them over a ridge, the world shifted in an instant. 500 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors rose from concealment surrounding the cavalry with speed and precision. Arrows, rifles, and war cries tore through the morning air. The ambush was complete. The soldiers had no time to form a defensive line, no way to regroup, no path to retreat. The charge that had begun with confidence collapsed into chaos. Within minutes, the battle was over. Every member of the detachment was killed. To the Lakota, the victory was known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand, a name that reflected the overwhelming nature of the triumph. It became a story carried from camp to camp, a reminder of how one warrior's courage and cleverness could turn the tide of war. For the United States, it was one of the most devastating defeats of the era. For Crazy Horse, it was proof that even a small force guided by strategy and unity could strike a blow that would be remembered for generations. The cold morning of 1866 became a milestone in Lakota resistance. And the lone rider who led the soldiers into the hills showed the frontier that the most dangerous warrior was the one who understood exactly when to appear weak. By the summer of 1860, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne had been pushed to the edge. The Black Hills had been taken despite treaty promises. The bison, the heart of their world, were being slaughtered for profit. And government agents insisted the tribes abandon their homelands and move on to distant reservations. To Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, these were not policies. They were attacks on the very existence of their people. Little Bighorn was not a battle that happened by chance. It was the moment they chose to strike back. Sitting Bull's vision had warned him that a great fight was coming. Warriors would fall, but they would win a victory powerful enough to shake the United States. Guided by that vision, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered in one of the largest native camps ever seen on the northern plains. They were not there to start a war. They were there to protect their families and their way of life. But when Custer rode toward the valley, war found them anyway. The strategy they used was simple, elegant, and devastating. The first layer of the plan drew Custer into the valley. Lightly armed warriors showed themselves, then pulled back, tempting him forward and convincing him that the village was on the run. It was the same tactic that had brought victory at the 100 in the hand, and Custer fell for it just as completely. As his men pressed deeper into the valley, the second layer closed around them. Warriors swept in from the flanks, striking at angles that shattered the cavalry's ability to form a defensive line. The soldiers expected a frightened village. What they faced instead was a coordinated assault delivered by riders who knew the land and knew how to use speed as a weapon. Then came the final blow. Crazy Horse led a charge that broke the last of Custer's formation. Witnesses described him riding through the dust and gunfire with a calm intensity, leading warriors who attacked with such force that the cavalry collapsed in minutes. Once the line broke, the fight was over. Custer and every man with him died on the ridge that would forever carry his name. Little Bighorn became the most famous native counterstrike in North American history. It was a moment when two great leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, answered years of broken promises and violent encroachment, with a victory so complete that it changed the way the nation looked at the Plains tribes. It did not end the war. It did not restore the Black Hills, but it proved that even in the face of overwhelming pressure, the Lakota and Cheyenne could still rise together and deliver a blow powerful enough to echo across generations. Revenge was never chaos. It was strategy. And for native warriors, it was survival. Every counterstrike we've explored was born from an attack that came first from a wound delivered to a people who had already endured more than most nations could bear. None of these battles began with ambition or conquest. They began with loss, a burned village, a murdered family, a land taken without consent. When the warriors rode out, they were answering a violence that had already left its mark. These acts of retaliation shaped the course of frontier history. They forced armies to change tactics, slowed expansion, and challenged the belief that native nations would simply fade away. Each revenge strike carried a weight far heavier than the clash of weapons. It carried the resolve of people fighting for their future and the understanding that survival sometimes required striking back with everything they had. The stories of Tecumseh, Roman Nose, Geronimo, Crazy Horse, Quanah Parker, and so many others remind us that the frontier was never a simple struggle of settlers and soldiers. It was a landscape of competing worlds, each trying to hold its ground as the pressure mounted from every direction. Their decisions, their battles, and their sacrifices still echo today, long after the dust of those conflicts has settled. And while this chapter closes, the frontier holds hundreds of untold stories. There are more warriors whose names deserve to be heard, more moments of courage and tragedy waiting to be uncovered. The question now is simple: which warrior should we tell next?